Here it is, the Van Gogh letter, £600,000 and 20. At 620,000, we'll offer me 650 at 620,000. 650 is here with Chris at 650, 680. 700,000 at £750,000. So, 910. Thank you.
You've just seen a world record being set, £750,000. It's the most ever paid for a letter. It's a kind of madness, really, this mania for Van Gogh. He's our favourite artist. We spend millions on him, but we don't know that much about him. Not really. Yet the full story of Vincent van Gogh is a tale worth hearing.
Starry, starry night. Paint your palette blue and grey. Look out on a summer's day.
If you want to witness just how dramatically the world has taken leave of its senses when it comes to Vincent van Gogh, I recommend a visit to his hometown of Zundert. This is a famous flower festival they have here. And all these floats, made of millions and millions and millions of flowers, are dedicated to Vincent. Tens of thousands of people have turned up to see them. Now, I like flowers too, and the effort that's gone into creating these things is unimaginable. I mean, look at that. It's fantastic. But, unfortunately, all this has nothing, absolutely nothing, to do with the real Vincent van Gogh. Vincent would have hated it. Van Gogh's father was the preacher here in Zundert, Pastor Theodorus van Gogh of the Dutch Reformed Church. If you look down from the pulpit, there's a little brass bowl. That's the font in which Vincent was christened in 1853. A noisy little boy with red hair, Vincent Willem van Gogh, the first of 6 children, all christened in this church, all by their own father. We're actually in Catholic Brabant, a tiny bit of Holland that pokes into Belgium. It's Belgium, really. So the Van Goghs were surrounded by Catholics. The Protestant community here is tiny. It kept them close. They were outcasts together, pioneers. That house behind me, the bright yellow one, that's the house Vincent grew up in. It's not the real one, of course. It's one they've recreated out of 500,000 dahlias. They like growing flowers here in Zundert. But he did actually live just a little bit up the road in that house there. That's been rebuilt too, but it stands in exactly the place that Vincent spent the first 16 years of his life. It's rather touching to be here. And something I didn't know, I didn't realise till I got here. He did an early drawing. There are about 12 of his early drawings left, and there's one of this rather strange architectural feature. It looks like a capital of a church or a bank or something, and no one really knew where it was, and I certainly didn't know where it was. And then you come here and you realise that actually it's a capital from the top of the town hall in Zundert across the road. He must have sat there in his bedroom, looked straight out of the window and seen this pilaster in front of him. So what it actually is the first of the drawings that Vincent did of the view from his bedroom window, this funny little pilaster. And it's a habit he kept up all his life. Every room he ever stayed in, he would draw what's outside of it. And it began here, as everything did.
Starry, starry night. Paint your palette blue and grey. Look out on a summer's day, with eyes that know the darkness in my soul. Shadows on the hills. Sketch your trees and daffodils.
Vincent had been deliberately named after his uncle, another Vincent van Gogh, a hugely successful art dealer whom everyone called Uncle Cent. When Vincent was 16, he was packed off to The Hague, where Uncle Cent had a gallery. He was going to be an art dealer too. Vincent had a special post created for him as an apprentice clerk at the Hague branch of Goupil & Co., the world's most prestigious art franchise, who'd merged with Uncle Cent. It was a behind-the-scenes job at first, dealing with Goupil's extensive international paperwork. Amazingly, Van Gogh turned out to be good at this and was soon promoted to front of shop. Rich Hague clients would turn up here in their carriages. They'd be met by the teenage Vincent van Gogh, who'd escort Sir and Madam inside and commend them on their taste when Sir and Madam decided on their purchase. This is the 3-volume correspondence of Vincent to his brother Theo. It's the biggest, heaviest and most celebrated epistolic package in art. I've tackled it a couple of times now, and it took me several months each go. Vincent's almost as famous for writing these letters as he is for painting the sunflowers. There's so much insight here into his creative thinking. But the very first letter was just a brief note about the weather, scribbled to Theo from The Hague in September 1872. Theo was a couple of years younger than Vincent, but he also decided to become an art dealer while Vincent was here. They hoped one day they might work together. But on the 17th of March, 1873, a rather glum Vincent wrote to Theo to tell him that he was going to be moved. It was another promotion. He'd done so well in The Hague that he was being sent to London. He was 20. He arrived at Victoria Station on the 19th of May, 1873, and soon found some lodgings somewhere in Battersea. He spoke decent English. It quickly improved. Within weeks, he was reading Keats. London came at him from all sides. It was the largest city in the world, and 4 million people had somehow squeezed themselves into it. Here's what it looked like. This is Gustave Doré's London, published just before Vincent got here. Look at the state of it. This is Ludgate Hill, looking up towards St. Paul's. Look at those crowds.
I've got a pal, a regular out and outer.
Vincent had a copy of this and treasured it. You might recognise this image as well. It's Newgate Prison. 2 decades later, he still hadn't forgotten it.
For 40 years, and it don't seem a day too much. There ain't.
Vincent described his first year in London as the happiest of his life. He went boating on the Thames, he visited the museums, the parks, but what really cheered him up was moving here, to 87 Hackford Road, Brixton, where Vincent had a room at the top that he loved. I don't need to tell you what Brixton is today. It's yardie country, dangerous. But it wasn't like that in Vincent's time. In 1873, this was a prosperous middle-class suburb. No one knew where Vincent lived in London until 1971, when a postman, a Van Gogh obsessive called Paul Chalcroft, tracked him down to this house. Chalcroft was on strike at the time, getting ready for the 3-day week with lots of hours on his hands. There's a Mrs. Smith living here now, and I imagine it was a heck of a surprise when the striking postman knocked on her door and told her that Van Gogh lived here. You must be Mrs. Smith.
Hello. Good morning.
Do you know,
yes, I am.
I've read so much about you.
Really?
And about this house.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I really want to ask you, right?
Come through.
What was it like when the postman turned up, the striking postman?
Paul Chalcroft.
Paul
It was
Chalcroft.
very exciting, actually.
Is that one of his?
That's Van Gogh, and that's Paul Chalcroft too.
I mean, he was obsessed with Vincent,
He
wasn't he?
absolutely knew everything about Vincent from the day he was born to the day he went. In fact, his wife said to me, "I don't know where to put all these pictures driving of Van Gogh. It's driving me balmy." It's not a bit like it was when he was here.
Well, it must still be more or less the same. You've
No.
sort of fenced in the stairs, haven't you?
Yes, I did. This was the room he slept in.
This one here?
This one here, and the two windows. That's all the paintings in there.
There's the church over there.
And that's right. That's Paul Sharcroft's work again.
And do you sleep here now, Mrs. Smith? Is this your bedroom?
Yes, it's my bedroom.
So you sleep in the room that Van Gogh slept in?
Yes, I do.
That must be quite exciting. I'd be excited.
I can't hear him snoring at all.
Lucky you.
No.
I bet he did. His landlady, Mrs. Ursula Lawyer, ran a small school here. She also took lodgers. Vincent was working in Covent Garden at Goupil's London office, and every morning he walked to work in a top hat he'd bought specially. He thought it made him look more English. This journey to Covent Garden took him 45 minutes, and that's not easy.
A wandering minstrel, like a thing of threads.
Van Gogh was a ridiculously fast walker. He shot past the Oval, where the English played that strange game called cricket. He didn't enjoy the fog. It depressed him. And the river, pumped full of sewage, used to stink so badly he hurried across it. But he loved this view over Westminster Bridge. The Houses of Parliament, just built. The Thames embankment, newly reclaimed from 32 acres of mud. And he couldn't have missed the poverty. You know that expression, slumming it? Well, slumming was something Londoners used to do in Vincent's time. It means going to look at the slums. The worst ones were in the East End, Whitechapel, Bethnal Green, terrifying places, underage prostitutes lurking in the alleys, and an unbuilt sewage system pumping crap into the streets. I know you won't believe this, but I really did that. It took me 53 minutes. That's 8 minutes more than Vincent. I need to do it twice a day, strolling to work, strolling back. He worked just there at Goupil's, which is a noodle restaurant now. He was basically selling prints and earning £90 a year, which is actually a very good salary in those days, about 3 times the average payment for a labourer.
A wandering minstrel, like a thing of threads and patches.
Van Gogh's favourite English writer was Dickens. He read most of the novels and then reread them. He was always quoting Dickens in his letters, gobbling up Dickens's sympathy for the London poor, all those blighted Oliver Twists scrounging in the streets. Dickens opened Vincent's eyes to modern human misery. Dickens died in 1870, just before Vincent got here. To commemorate his death, one of Vincent's favourite Victorian sentimentalists, Luke Fildes, produced an unforgettable image of Dickens's empty chair pushed away from his desk. Vincent bought this illustration and learned from it how an empty chair can stand in so poignantly for a missing person. Haunted by this image, Vincent went on to become the greatest painter of empty chairs there's ever been.
And to your humours changing, I tune my subtle song. I tune my subtle song.
Vincent's landlady in Brixton, Mrs. Lawyer, had a daughter, Eugenie, who was 19, a year younger than Vincent. Perhaps the chief reason why he enjoyed his first year in London so much was because Eugenie was here. Vincent fell for her all the way. He was besotted. What's extraordinary is that he didn't tell her he was in love with her for almost a year. He kept it bottled up. He let it fester. Vincent never said a word. When it finally came out, an amazed Eugenie informed him that she was already secretly engaged to a previous lodger, an engineer called Samuel Ploughman. The effect on Vincent of this firm and terrible rejection was devastating. When Eugenie rejected him, Vincent did what many before him have done and will always do. He found religion. He didn't have to look very far. It was already there in his blood, his upbringing. He started reading the Bible at nights, puffing away at his pipe, coming home early from work. He'd go to Salvation Army meetings at Elephant and Castle, hang around the soup kitchens and the prayer halls, sinking ever deeper into a melancholy love stupor. His work was now going so badly that his bosses decided to transfer him again to Paris. This is the old Goupil headquarters in Paris, where Vincent was made head of pictures. He didn't deserve it, so it can only have been intended as a deliberate confidence booster. It's for sale now. It's been turned into a loft.
So you're coming in the gallery Goupil.
As head of pictures, Vincent was the chief salesman here. The way it was supposed to work was that Vincent would greet the rich clients, commend them on their taste, and sell them the most expensive stuff on the walls. Simple, but it didn't work out like that. The new religious Vincent chose instead to question their taste, argue with them, and suggest they buy some proper landscapes instead of the salon nonsenses that were hanging all around them here. It was actually a fascinating time in the Parisian art world. A few months before Vincent was transferred here, a bunch of disaffected artistic rebels, whom cruel critics had dubbed the Impressionists, had opened and closed their first show. But Vincent was too immersed in his new obsession with the Bible to take any notice of them whatsoever. Vincent had found a room up here in Montmartre. Montmartre means the Hill of Martyrs, and a martyr is definitely what he now fancied himself to be. He spent every evening up in that little room reading the Bible and praying feverishly. "Get rid of all your books," he wrote to Theo, "and keep only the Bible." Goupil employees were expected to work over Christmas. It was the busiest selling period of the year. But without telling anybody, Vincent bunked off at Christmas that year and spent it in Holland with his family. When he returned to Paris, he was summoned into the boss's office and asked to resign. Okay, merci.
Merci.
Goupils gave him 3 months' notice, which was generous of them. Vincent had been reading the English papers in Paris, looking through the classifieds for a job. He eventually found one here in Ramsgate, teaching French, German, arithmetic and dictation to young boys at a school opened in this building by a Mr. William Stokes. This job was unpaid, just board and lodging, but he was teaching, and that pressed Vincent's vocational buzzer. The school was crummy, Dickensian one might say. The floors of the bedroom in which the boys slept were rotten, the windows broken. And Vincent complained desperately about the bed bugs. He did a couple of drawings out of the school window of this view. They're rather delightful. Stokes turned out to be entirely unreliable. Just 2 months after he got here, Vincent learned that the school was closing and moving to Isleworth, a London suburb where Stokes promised Vincent a proper job. Vincent decided to walk there and to visit his sister on the way, who was teaching in Welwyn, a mere 100 miles away. Vincent got there in 3 days.
I've got a pal, a regular out and outer. She's a dear old girl. Oh, I'll tell you all about her.
This walking business wasn't just a case of saving on rail fares. He was driven to do it by the religious mania that was growing in him. He'd been reading Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. It affected him immediately. He wasn't a penniless Dutch teacher walking to see his sister. He was a humble pilgrim making his difficult way in life. It's a feeling Vincent never lost. And did any man ever show as much affection for his trusty boots as Vincent, years later, went on to show?
A lady living in their land, as I swap for my dear old Dutch. There ain't a lady living in the land that I swap for my dear old Dutch.
Stokes' school in Isleworth turned out to be another no-hoper. But just down the Twickenham Road was another boys' school run by the Reverend Thomas Slade Jones, a congregational minister, the first man ever to understand fully Vincent's religious passion. The Reverend was one of the few heroes of Vincent's life. He gave him a job at this school and paid him. It was in this house that Vincent's frantic Bible reading and growing religious mania finally found an outlet. He decided he wanted to be some sort of missionary. Teaching wasn't enough for him. He thought about going up north to work among the poor in the dark satanic mills. But there was quite enough poverty to be getting on with in London, where a man with a religious mission could find plenty to do. These are the minute books of the Turnham Green Congregational Church for 1876, and look who's in them, named as a new church worker, an assistant preacher, Mr. Van Gogh. Look at the spelling, it's wrong. That's why he began calling himself Vincent. He was fed up with the English getting his name wrong. As Mr. Richardson proposed, Mr. Stembridge seconded that Mr. Vincent Van Gogh, spelt G-O-F, be accepted as a co-worker. The Reverend Slade Jones, pestered mightily, one imagines, by Mr. Van Gogh, and boy could Mr. Van Gogh pester, was finally persuaded to allow Vincent to step across that crucial religious divide that separates the sheep from the shepherds. On the 29th of October, 1876, on a sunny autumn Sunday, Vincent rose before the faithful at the Richmond Methodist Chapel in suburban West London and delivered his first sermon. We still have it. We know exactly what he said to his first congregation. It's an old belief and a good belief that our life is a pilgrim's progress, that we are strangers on the earth, but that it's long, well-meaning, repetitive, boring. Every few sentences, it resorts to thick bundles of biblical quotation and would have left many of us dozing in the aisles. The most impressive thing about it for me is that it's in English, a language he'd mastered so quickly. He must have had help writing it, perhaps from the Reverend Slade Jones. On the road walks a pilgrim, staff in hand. He's been walking for a good long while. Since none of us has time to listen to it all, let me tell you that its main theme was pilgrimage. Life is tough, the road is long, but faith in God will see us through. And it all feels sneakily autobiographical. Further ahead in our story, after some turbulent religious times, the preacher who stood up here and delivered his first sermon was to give up religion rather fiercely and claim to despise it. But one of the keys to understanding the real Van Gogh is to realise that once all this has soaked into his art, it could never be removed. Never. That Christmas, Vincent went home to his family. He said he'd return to London after the holidays, but he never did. Whatever promises he'd made to his new flock in England, his family forced him to break. Instead of returning to Isleworth after Christmas, Vincent was packed off to this cute little town, Dordrecht, where his family had come up with a new calling for him. He was going to be a bookseller. His boss was to be a Mr. Braat, and the bookshop stood right there where that cafe is. Actually, I can easily imagine Vincent as an eccentric book dealer. His family always remembered him with his nose stuck in a book, and later he'd go on to paint books with such love and excitement. It didn't matter how humble a book was, Vincent's art always stressed its preciousness. The booksellers I know tend to be scruffy, cranky, unwashed types, lost in their own world, just like Vincent. He would sit in the corner wearing his English top hat, ignoring the customers, as booksellers do, and busying himself with the remarkable task he'd set himself here in Dordrecht. Vincent, remember, spoke 4 languages fluently, and he decided to produce a translation of the Bible in all of them simultaneously: Dutch, French, German and English. He divided his paper into 4 columns and inched his way through the Bible in 4 languages at once. This is a painting he did some years later of his father's Bible. It's still being used in Zundert. The book-selling job didn't work out, of course. Vincent was still determined to join the church, like his father and his grandfather. Amsterdam University had a 6-year theology course, and Pastor Theodorus fixed it for his son to get on it, providing he passed some exams in Latin and Greek. Vincent, alas, turned out to be unusually hopeless at both of them. Something unsettling happened here in Amsterdam, something I find disturbing. If Vincent's studies weren't going well, he used to punish himself by picking up a cudgel and beating himself across the back until he bled. And on particularly cold nights, he used to come home late, deliberately, so that the door to this house would be locked, and he'd be forced to spend the night outside, shivering. These were weird habits, and perhaps they were habits he never lost. Vincent never made it onto the theology course. He dropped out. The only religious calling still open to someone as unqualified as him was to become a missionary, the lowest of the low. A place called Laken in Belgium had a training school for evangelists, which he failed to get into, of course. But a kindly teacher at this school, the Reverend Peterson, remember that name, liked something about him and arranged for Vincent to be given a trial period, ministering to the miners in the notorious boringage. The borinage's geographic nickname hereabouts is the Black Earth Country. It's a bleak industrial stretch of slag heaps and mine workings, straddling the border between France and Belgium, spoiling the land on both sides. He'd looked up the boringage in an encyclopedia, and this encyclopedia informed him that this was a happy working community, populated by a race of friendly miners who descended into the earth every day, content in the knowledge that they were being useful and serving God. But that's in the encyclopedia. In real life, the boringage was hell on earth. And while the mine owners back in Brussels were coining it, the poor sods stuck here were leading some of the grimmest lives available to man in so-called civilized Europe. Vincent's duties as a preacher were twofold. Here in Wham, where he lodged in the interesting pink house behind me, there was also a converted dance hall that was used as a makeshift Protestant chapel. Vincent preached there to the few miners who turned up and their families, and he'd deliver his notoriously long sermons. He would also do the rounds of the miners' houses and conduct Bible classes there, communal gospel read-ins. Thus he found out exactly how the miners were living, and it appalled him. There's a trait we need to keep an eye on with Vincent. It's a powerful urge, a recurring one, to hurt himself. He wanted to do more with the miners than just conduct their Bible classes. He needed also to share their misery. So he began giving away his food and his clothes too, starving himself, shivering in the cold, just like them. He even stopped washing so that he too, like the miners, was stained a permanent black. Now in this community, grim though it was, the preacher was still someone you looked up to. Mrs. Denis, the landlady of the house here, complained about him not washing. "Oh, Esther," he replied, "don't worry about the details. They don't matter in heaven." Vincent persuaded one of the older miners to take him down into a pit, and he described the experience in a particularly evocative letter to Theo. Down in the mine shaft, the diggings were arranged like a beehive, with one cramped chamber next to another, inside each of which a pathetic black figure would be picking away at the walls. Pick, pick, pick. Vincent was surprised to find horses down here, tragic beasts fated to spend their days trudging backwards and forwards, pulling the carts. There were 8-year-old kids as well, small enough to squeeze into any hole. I was wondering why missionaries were being sent to the boringage at all. I mean, it's hardly the deepest Congo, and Brussels is only a few hours away. I found the answer here, in Germinal by Émile Zola. It's the finest mining novel ever written, and it's set on the French side of the boringage. Read page 45, and you'll see that there were women down here too. With their smaller bodies, they too could squeeze into tighter spaces. But it was hot, and they didn't wear much. Zola describes how a miner, coming around a dark corner, encountered the immensely tempting sight of one of these young girls, down on her hands and knees, with her back to him. I won't go on. But this is why they sent the missionaries to the boringage, to preach against promiscuity and sin. And it's true, every slither of symbolism you encounter in these mines feels satanic and hellish. Remember, Vincent was on trial here. His appointment as a preacher was temporary. He wanted it renewed, but it depended on his performance. After he'd been here about 6 months, they sent someone down from Brussels to inspect him. The Reverend Roche-Dieu was his name. Roche-Dieu in French means the rock of God, a terrifying name. And this terrifying Roche-Dieu discovered Vincent starving, filthy, unkempt, manically identifying with the miners, and recommended that he be sacked. Vincent's example, reported Roche-Dieu, was a bad one. Vincent was devastated, absolutely devastated. He'd already been brutally rejected in love, and now the church, to which he'd given so much, was also rejecting him. As soon as he'd shaken out some of the shock, he set off on another of his absurd walks, this time all the way to Brussels. It took him over a week, and he cornered one of his old superiors from Laeken, the kindly Reverend Peterson. And for some unknowable, instinctive, curious reason, Vincent took with him to Brussels a batch of the drawings he'd been making of the boringage miners. They looked as if they'd been scrawled out of crude black bits of the boringage itself, raw, clumsy. He's already 27 and he has the drawing skills of a child. But Reverend Peterson saw something here and encouraged Vincent to go on. And there is something, isn't there? Thank God, say I, for the kindly Reverend Peterson, because without him, Vincent might still be in two minds today about his true calling. He came back here to the boringage and prevaricated some more for a whole year. But finally, in this lonely little miner's house in which he'd holed up, Vincent van Gogh concluded he should be an artist. Hallelujah. He knew at last what he wanted to become, but he couldn't do it here. There was no art here to set him an example. He knew that he had to get back to what he called the land of pictures, and after 2 years in the boringage, he decided abruptly to return to Brussels. We can't show you the little room above a cafe into which Vincent moved in Brussels when he turned up here in October 1880. It's been modernised into a railway bridge. But I can show you something better than that. I can show you this. It's a self-help book for artists, published originally in the 1860s by Charles Barg. Vincent would have known it from his days as an art dealer, and now here in Brussels, he began dutifully to work his way through it. The idea with Barg is that you copy one page after another, learning as you go. It's a mechanical slog. It wouldn't suit everyone, but it suited Vincent. He was, as we'll be seeing throughout the artistic helter-skelter ride that now lies ahead of us, an instinctive copyist. He stayed in Brussels for over 6 months. Everyone advised him to join the Academy of Arts up the road from here, but Vincent was reluctant. He knew what he was like in classroom situations. This was his academy. But you'll be wondering how this failed preacher with a talent for self-flagellation paid his way in Brussels. It's not a city where a little goes a long way. The small room above the cafe was 50 francs a month. There was food to buy, materials. The fact is that Vincent's father was still sending him money. It's not very impressive, is it? 27 years old and still scrounging off his parents. Pastor Theodorus was sending him 60 francs a month. And then suddenly, for no obvious reason, this went up to 100 francs. It was only later that Vincent found out the extra 40 francs were coming from his brother, Theo. Theo had been in Paris for 2 years, working as an art dealer and making quite a name for himself. And Theo was perhaps the only man on God's earth who welcomed Vincent's decision to become an artist. As soon as that decision was made, he began sending Vincent money, and would continue to do so for the rest of Vincent's life. This is Eton, a Dutch village in Brabant that was once so pretty. See this car park? That's where the Van Goghs used to live. Vincent's left us such a sweet drawing of his father's parsonage. It breaks my heart to look at it. Pastor Theodorus had been moved here, just up the road from Zundert, and in 1881, Vincent turned up for inglorious and obvious reasons. He was broke and needed once again to scrounge from his family now that he'd decided to become an artist. And there's a cycle route you can go on now that takes you through some of the places he drew as he launched his great struggle to conquer the pencil. I'm wobbling round it in the company of a local Van Gogh historian, Martin Monden, and he knows everything there is to know about Van Gogh in Eton. So this is a famous tree. This is the tree that Vincent drew when he was in Eton.
Yeah, that's right. It was called the orchard, and we call in Eton the mother tree. That means it is about close to 350 years old.
When Vincent came here after the boringage, this difficult time he had amongst the miners in Belgium, this was really the first place where he was determined to be an artist, isn't it, Eton?
Yeah.
Very important.
Well, he made a lot of drawings, 316, and he was here till December 1881.
So, Martin.
Yeah, Waldemar.
I recognise that view. That's the two towers, yeah?
Yeah, that's the two towers with the drawing by Van Gogh. Two towers, the landscape is the rising thunderstorm, you know.
It's a roundabout now.
Yes, now a roundabout with sunflowers.
This would have been the place that before was full of what? Fields, people digging, labourers' cottages, yeah?
That's right. It was a very small, narrow street with on both sides small houses and farmer houses, and the diggers were living here, which were drawn by Van Gogh.
There's some of it, I think, some of his most beautiful drawings here were the drawings of people working.
Yeah,
there's the man by the fire, but there's also the diggers, people gathering potatoes.
Yeah.
And they're all done around here in this area.
All around here, yes.
I recognise his father's church, of course. That's the one on the right.
Yeah, that's right. The right-hand church, and that's the Christian Reformed Church.
At least it hasn't changed very much.
No.
Everything else has, hasn't it, in Eton?
It is the same like 120 years ago, only the parsonage is gone.
And the roundabout has come.
And the roundabout is coming, yes.
Okay.
That's right.
Something horrible happened to Vincent here in Eton. His cousin, Kay Voss, a widow with a baby boy, came to spend the summer in the parsonage, and Vincent inevitably fell in love with her. Women in black, widows, were a weakness of his. When Vincent could no longer contain his passion for Kay and blurted out how he felt about her, she dealt him and his love of widows a mortal blow. "No, no, never," she replied, words he couldn't forget and kept quoting. "No, no, never." Stupidly, Vincent took this as a maybe. So he followed her to Amsterdam, pushed his way into her house, but she wasn't there. She was hiding from him. So he put his hand into a flame and told her family he'd keep it there unless he saw her. Her uncle just stood up and blew the flame out. It was a ridiculous but critical event. His parents were appalled at his behaviour, everybody was. But Vincent couldn't see what he'd done wrong. Was loving someone too much a crime? Years later, when he was in Arles with Gauguin, Vincent painted a mysterious picture called Memory of the Garden in Eton. It shows a pair of widows. One is his mother, and he always said that the other was his sister Wilhelmina. But doesn't she look like the spitting image of Kay Voss? "No, no, never," she said. How it must have hurt. You know, Vincent's life was peppered with lousy Christmases. when he hacked off his ear at the other end of this story. That was at Christmas. And the one he had in Eton in 1881 was another of the very worst. He stormed out on Christmas Day itself, refused to go to church, and left immediately for here, The Hague. There, he must have trawled the red light district, or perhaps visited an address he already knew, where he sought out a prostitute called Christine Klasina Maria Hornick, who, for some complex Dutch linguistic reason, was called Sien. Vincent seems already to have known this Sien. How else to explain the extreme abruptness with which he took up with her? Before Christmas, Kay Voss was his life, his destiny, his everything. After Christmas, he's with Sien and wants to marry her, from one to the other in a week. Sien was a few years older than him, and as people are fond of pointing out, she was no beauty. Pockmarked with smallpox, she had a shrewish face and looked used, discarded. Sien already had a 5-year-old daughter. She'd had 2 miscarriages and was pregnant again when Vincent met her. She would later have that baby whilst they were living together. So life had dealt her one crappy hand after another and wrinkled her prematurely. But these wrinkles attracted Vincent every bit as fiercely as some men are attracted by long legs or fluttering eyelashes. He liked his women faded. She was bad-tempered, but he forgave her that. She swore crazily, but he forgave her that. She drank, she smoked, he forgave all of it, because, unlike the rest of them, she stayed with him. The woman is as attached to me as a tame dove, he wrote, so pleased. Sien is the only woman Van Gogh ever lived with. They set up house in the street behind me, here in the Hague outskirts, where it used to be cheaper and the trains keep you awake at night.
With your long blonde hair and your eyes of blue.
Vincent's best drawing so far, his first masterpiece, was of Sien. He gave it an English title.
Sorrow.
Sorrow. He wanted her to look like a root, he said, clinging to the earth for survival. And she does.
High-class games of sorrow. Sorrow.
It was all looking so good. He had a woman, he was settled, but would it last? What do you think?
Tells me you're the devil's daughter. Sorrow. I tried to find her 'cause I can't resist her. I never